Hello. Okay, concept 3. Discuss how the first generation Congregationalists failed to reproduce the religious experience, which led to the modification of the values and institutions of the church and the people themselves. So the problem for the Congregationalists was that the religious experience that I described earlier, this whole sense of predestination of grace and the Protestant work ethic and trying to using the state as a way to insulate the person from their natural state and to identify for themselves if they were in the grace of God. All of that was just a one-generation experience. The first-generation Congregationalists failed to maintain control over the colony for 3 reasons. Because of all of these really spiritual high expectations. For the Congregationalists, church membership was not to be presumptive. It was not assumed by birth, like the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, but instead should be a joint decision made by a would-be member and those already in the church. People who were obvious sinners or ignorant of Christian doctrine were automatically rejected. But what about the outwardly just and those who were scripturally knowledgeable but who lacked compelling evidence that they had experienced God's grace? In the late 1630s, the Great Migration in full swing and new arrivals clamoring for admission to the churches, the Congregationalists found it easy to be very critical in evaluating a person's spiritual state. But by the 1650s, the Great Migration was over. Applications were down, and some of the saints began to have second thoughts. Second, so basically, these high expectations of who was to be in the church was great while there were a lot of people moving to the New World from Great Britain, but as this begins to slowly decrease, they're not able to be as picky as they once were. Second, the decline in the membership appears to have come from partly because the religion was not meeting the needs of the second generation. The Congregationalists tried to put restrictions on social mobility and thus created tensions between the desires, practices, and values of the merchant capitalism and the Congregationalist concept of a controlled society. So this tension and resulting conflict caused most young people to simply decline to submit themselves to such religious and personal scrutiny. Merchant capitalism was a form of individualism. Puritanism, particularly Congregationalist as it was practiced in Massachusetts, was a communal ideology developed in an environment which favored and encouraged individualism. Thus, it was not an accident that Anne Hutchinson supporters were drawn mainly from the ranks of the better-off merchants of Boston, and it was individual merchants who were often severely disciplined by the churches for their attempt to get the highest price the market would bear. This was exemplified by Robert Kean. Kean was a striking example of social mobility in early Massachusetts. Starting as a poor butcher's boy near London, he had won considerable success as a middleman in the making of clothing before he migrated to Boston in 1635. By the time he died in 1653, he had accumulated an estate worth about £4,000, an enormous fortune back then. Because he had tried to be a good Congregationalist as well as a successful businessman, Kean felt the conflict between business success and the Congregationalist faith. Because of some of his successful business dealings and because of his he was a member of the church, he was criticized, fined, and forced to make a public confession of repentance. When he finally retired from business, he spent 5 months just before his death in 1653 writing a 50,000-word will in which he defended the actions for which he had been condemned. This document shows how hard it was for the first Congregationalists to justify worldly success. How long could this better-off merchant class continue to support the church? How long could the growing numbers of non-members be compelled to attend church? These questions raised created problems that ministers could not defer. Also, the magistrates found it harder to defend the policies of withholding the vote from otherwise qualified taxpayers because they were not church members. So by the 1650s, it was clear that if nothing was done, a majority of the people soon would be living in a state of original sin. If that happened, how could Puritan values, and for that matter, the Congregational church itself, remain the dominant force in New England life? Third, what really helped bring about reconsideration of the membership policy were the concerns of non-members' parents about the souls of their children who could not be baptized, right? Again, baptism was not something that happened when you were a baby or even as a young child. It would be something that would happen when you were older, right? And understood exactly what you were getting into when you realized that you were in the graces of God. But it was a tall order of glass to walk up to in this approach. So not many people are getting baptized, which means if you're not get baptized, you're going to hell. So by 1660, it became clear that many of the children, second generation, of the first generation settlers were not having their own conversion experience, even though they had been baptized as youths in earlier spiritual followings. The difficulty of the situations were compounded when the second generation had children of their own, the grandchildren of the original saints. Could these children be baptized? Theoretically, each congregation could make up its own mind, but the problem was so universal that the ministers of the colony tried to find a common solution. This common solution led to two modifications in church practice, which marked the beginning of the end of the first generation of Congregationalists' religious experiment. They devised what was known as the Halfway Covenant of 1662. The Halfway Covenant recommended limited or halfway membership baptism for any child descendant from a church member, even a grandparent or a great-grandparent who was known not to be a sinner and who was willing to accept the provisions of the church covenant. Since there were 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents, this meant that almost every infant had some claim to baptism. Although halfway members and their children could be baptized, the sacrament of communion and a voice in church decision-making were reserved for full members only. Halfway members could later apply for full membership if they had their spiritual experience. By 1664, the right to vote was extended to halfway members. The ministers' motives were obvious. They wanted to bring as many people under the umbrella of the church as possible. If they could not do it through conversion, they would accept baptism at a halfway measure. At the time of the Halfway Covenant, was not universally accepted. Opponents of the Halfway Covenant argued that it reflected a slackening of religious practice. To the aging saints who had made up the largest group of opponents, the solution was not to make membership easier, but to hold the line and force their grandchildren to face the same emotional and spiritual tests they had to face. The second modification developed by 1690 was called the Covenant of Works, which was being a good citizen, going to church and contributing your fair share to the church. In time, by 1690, those born into the elect would dominate the membership of the Congregationalist Church and the Halfway Covenant, and would become universally accepted, particularly after the deaths of the original migrants. Thus, the Covenant of Works slipped into place. In order to solve the problem of the merchant class, particularly as Boston, Salem, and other towns along the coast came came to have larger and richer classes of merchants, it became clear that the old Puritan values would have to give way to a new, more relaxed and liberal form of Protestantism, with which the new capitalists could feel comfortable, the covenant of works, right? So if you are a good person, you are obviously accepted into the church. None of this predestination and worrying about it and having a church member decide if you were going to be in the church or not by 1690. All right, that's concept 3. I'll see you all in concept 4. Let me know if you have any questions.